You're standing in a line that stretches as far as your eyes can see. Thousands of faces, all captured, all terrified. The Mongol warriors on horseback circle like wolves, their eyes scanning the crowd with cold calculation. You can hear the sobbing, the prayers whispered in a dozen different languages. Then the command comes harsh, final. You're pushed forward, toward the walls of your own city. Arrows will fly soon. You know this, everyone knows this. You're not here to fight. You're here to die first. To absorb the violence meant for the men behind you, your city's defenders will have to watch their own people, their farmers, their merchants, their children fall before a single Mongol soldier is touched. This is how Genghis Khan wages war. This is how he uses human beings as tools, as shields, as messages written in blood. Before we descend deeper into this darkness, I'd love to know where in the world are you watching this from. It's incredible to me that a story from 8 centuries ago still reaches across every border, every ocean, speaking to something we all recognize in ourselves, the need to understand how far power can fall. The year is 1219, and the Mongol Empire is at its zenith. Genghis Khan, born Temujin, a man who clawed his way from the edges of starvation to command the largest contiguous land empire in human history, rules from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. His name alone empties cities. Chronicles from Persia, China, and Eastern Europe all record the same phenomenon. When word arrived that the Mongols were coming, populations fled into mountains, into deserts, into anywhere that might hide them from what was about to unfold. But not everyone could run, and those who were captured entered a system of slavery so methodical, so psychologically devastating, that it challenges our modern understanding of what conquest meant in the medieval world. This isn't a story about random cruelty. It's about calculated terror, about how a brilliant military mind turned human suffering into a weapon as precise as any cavalry charge. The chroniclers who documented these events, Persian historians like Abd-al-Malik Juvayni, Chinese officials who served the Mongol court, even European monks who traveled east and returned with testimonies, all struggled with the same problem: how to describe what they'd witnessed without sounding hysterical, without losing credibility. Yet their accounts align in disturbing ways. They speak of practices so systematic that they were clearly policy, not aberration. The first reports that confused Western historians came from refugees streaming into Europe in the 1220s. They told stories that seemed impossible, exaggerated by fear. But as more evidence accumulated, as Mongol administrative records were translated, a picture emerged that was somehow worse than the panicked rumors. Because what Genghis Khan did to enslaved populations wasn't just brutal, it was efficient. It served multiple purposes simultaneously: military and psychological, immediate and long-term. Consider the siege of Otrar in 1219, the city whose governor had made the fatal mistake of executing Mongol envoys. The city was prosperous, defended by high walls and thousands of troops. Genghis Khan arrived with his army and immediately sent riders out to the surrounding farmlands and villages. They captured everyone they could: find farmers, herders, families. Within days, tens of thousands of captives were assembled in camps outside the city walls. Then the Mongols issued their orders. These captives, people who had lived peaceful lives just weeks before, were formed into labor battalions. They were forced to fill in defensive moats, carrying baskets of earth and stone under constant arrow fire from their own city's defenders. Imagine being a farmer from a village outside Otrar, forced to approach walls where your cousin, your brother, your childhood friend stood with a bow, ordered to defend the city. The defenders faced an impossible choice: kill their own people or let the Mongol siege works advance unopposed. Historical records from the siege indicate that the defenders wept as they shot, that some refused and were executed by their own commanders for insubordination. Others aimed poorly on purpose, choosing to die themselves rather than kill the enslaved laborers. But Genghis Khan had calculated this: every hesitation, every arrow not fired, every moment of human compassion advanced his military objective. The moats were filled, the siege towers rolled closer, and when sections were completed, the enslaved laborers who survived weren't freed. They were moved to the next section, or kept for the next siege, or distributed among Mongol commanders as property. This practice, using captives as human shields and forced labor in siege warfare, appears in account after account. At the siege of Nishapur in 1221, after the city resisted and killed Genghis Khan's favorite son-in-law, Tokuka, the revenge was methodical. The Mongols captured surrounding populations and drove them toward the walls in waves. They were forced to carry siege equipment, to fill ditches, to scale walls, first in assault after assault. The Persian historian Juz-Jani, who compiled testimonies from survivors, recorded that the screams of these enslaved people as they were driven forward could be heard throughout the city, a sound that broke the defenders' will before the walls were even breached. When Nishapur finally fell, the slaughter was total. Every living thing, humans, cats, dogs, even, according to some accounts, plants in gardens, was destroyed. The city was leveled so completely that later travelers reported being unable to find where it had stood. But before that final annihilation, in the days of chaos after the walls fell, something else happened that reveals the depth of Genghis Khan's psychological warfare. The governor's family was captured. His son, a young man in his 20s, was brought before Genghis Khan. The Khan's daughter, Tokucher's widow, was present. She had just lost her husband to this city's resistance. The historical record here becomes fragmentary, preserved in different sources with slight variations, but the core remains consistent. Genghis Khan ordered the son to execute his own father to prove loyalty, to demonstrate the complete dissolution of all bonds except loyalty to the Mongol Khan. We don't have the son's name in most sources. He's simply recorded as the governor's son. But we have testimony that he refused, that he stood before the most powerful man in the world and said no. The consequences were swift. Both father and son were executed, but not before being forced to watch the systematic destruction of everything they'd known. Some chronicles suggest that Khan's daughter herself participated in determining the method of execution, that grief and rage had transformed her into someone who needed to see blood, answered with blood. This wasn't random sadism. It was theater. Every survivor of Nishapur, who was spared and, some were, deliberately, kept alive, carried the story with them. They became walking testimonies to what resistance cost. The story spread faster than the Mongol armies themselves, preparing the ground for future conquests. Cities hundreds of miles away heard what happened at Nishapur and opened their gates without a fight. But the military applications of enslaved populations extended beyond siege warfare. Genghis Khan implemented a system that Mongol administrators recorded in their census documents, that survive today in Chinese and Persian archives. Captured populations were categorized by skill. Artisans, metalworkers, bowmakers, armorsmiths were immediately valuable and received marginally better treatment. Though they were still slaves, their labor extracted under threat of death. They were transported across the empire to wherever their skills were needed, separated from families, from homelands, from any identity except their function. Ordinary captives faced harsher fates. They became the infrastructure of Mongol expansion. Archaeological evidence from Mongol-era sites shows massive earthworks roads, supply depots, fortifications built at a speed that was only possible through the exploitation of enormous labor forces. These weren't volunteers. They were enslaved populations driven forward by Mongol overseers, worked until they collapsed, then replaced by the next wave of captives. One particularly haunting category appears in Mongol administrative records, what they called hashar, a word meaning forced labor, but which came to encompass something more specific and terrible. These were populations kept in reserve specifically for military campaigns, people whose sole purpose was to be expended in sieges, used as human shields, driven into enemy fortifications to exhaust defenders' ammunition and strength before Mongol troops engaged. Chinese chroniclers from the period record a siege of a Jin dynasty fortress in 1232, where approximately 30,000 captives, men, women, the elderly, were driven forward in waves. The defenders shot until they ran out of arrows. Then they shot until they ran out of stones for their catapults. Then they watched, helpless, as the human tide continued, now mixed with Mongol soldiers, and the walls were overrun. The system worked with horrifying efficiency. But physical labor and military exploitation weren't the only purposes enslaved populations served. Genghis Khan understood that conquest required more than military victory. It required the complete psychological submission of the conquered. And so enslaved people were forced into roles designed to break their spirits, to demonstrate their powerlessness, to destroy the social bonds that might otherwise lead to rebellion. Historical sources document enslaved people being forced to fight each other for entertainment at Mongol camps. These weren't gladiatorial games with honored warriors. These were farmers, scholars, merchants, forced to battle to the death, while Mongol soldiers wagered on the outcomes. The survivors gained nothing but another day of life. Some sources suggest that occasionally winners were given small privileges, extra food, lighter work, creating a system where enslaved people were encouraged to turn on each other, to see fellow captives as obstacles to survival rather than potential allies. Even more psychologically devastating were the loyalty tests. Multiple chronicles record instances of captured officials or nobles being offered a choice: kill a family member or loved one and be elevated to a position of service in the Mongol administration, or refuse and watch everyone you love die slowly before joining them. Some chose death for themselves and their families, preserving their integrity in the only way left to them. Others chose survival, chose collaboration, and lived with that choice for whatever years remained to them. Genghis Khan seemed to prefer the latter, not because he valued their service especially, but because a man who had killed his own father or brother at the Khan's command would never rebel. His entire identity was now bound to the Mongol system. The sexual exploitation of enslaved populations followed similar patterns of systematic control. This aspect of Mongol conquest is well documented in sources from every region the empire touched. Women captured in raids and sieges were distributed among Mongol commanders and soldiers according to strict hierarchical rules. The most beautiful, the youngest, the daughters of nobility, these went to Genghis Khan himself, or to his sons and highest-ranking generals. The rest were parceled out down the chain of command. But this wasn't simply about lust or pleasure in any conventional sense. It was about demonstrating dominance, about literally claiming the future of conquered peoples. Genghis Khan fathered dozens of children with enslaved women from across his empire. His sons and grandsons did the same. A genetic study published in 2003 by researchers at Oxford University found that approximately 16 million men alive today, roughly 0.5% of the global male population, carry a Y chromosome, sequence that traces back to a single male ancestor who lived in Mongolia around the time of Genghis Khan. The statistical probability strongly suggests that ancestor was either Genghis Khan himself or one of his close male relatives. Think about what that means. 16 million living people carry genetic evidence of systematic sexual exploitation that occurred 8 centuries ago. That's not just a historical footnote. It's a biological record of conquest written into our very DNA. The treatment of enslaved women in Mongol camps is recorded in sources that still have the power to disturb modern readers. Persian chronicles describe women from noble families, women who had lived lives of education and relative privilege, produced 2 concubines for common soldiers. Chinese records document the transport of thousands of captured women across the empire. Separated from children and families, their entire purpose redefined as sexual and reproductive service. Genghis Khan himself maintained what sources describe as a harem of hundreds of women. The number varies by account, but even the most conservative estimates put it in the hundreds. These weren't wives in any meaningful sense. They were enslaved women from every corner of his empire, representing his conquest made flesh. When he died in 1227, Mongol custom dictated that 40% of the most beautiful girls be sacrificed to accompany him into the afterlife. The chronicles record this matter-of-factly as just another administrative detail in the transfer of power. But here's what those same chronicles reveal that's perhaps even more disturbing. The system worked. Genghis Khan's policies, the terror, the calculated cruelty, the systematic exploitation, exactly what they were designed to achieve. His empire expanded with unprecedented speed. Cities surrendered without fighting. Populations accepted Mongol rule as inevitable. The alternative was simply too terrible to contemplate, and not all of the enslaved remained enslaved. This is the paradox that makes understanding Genghis Khan so difficult. His system included mechanisms for advancement that were, for the medieval world, almost shockingly meritocratic. A captured craftsman who proved exceptionally skilled might be elevated to administrator status. A captured soldier who demonstrated loyalty might be incorporated into Mongol military units and, over time, treated as a full member. Women who bore sons to Mongol commanders sometimes gained significant status and protection. The Mongol Empire kept meticulous records, and those records show thousands of people with clearly foreign names: Chinese, Persian, Turkish, Russian serving in high administrative positions within decades of their people's conquest. Some of these were descended from enslaved populations. The empire created a pathway from slavery to power that was narrow and brutal, but genuinely existed. This complexity is what modern historians struggle with. How do you evaluate a system that was simultaneously one of history's most brutal regimes of slavery and exploitation, and also one of the most flexible and meritocratic empires of its era? How do you weigh the millions who died in terror and bondage against the survivors who found opportunity in the empire's cosmopolitan administrative class? There's no comfortable answer. The psychological impact on survivors is recorded in poetry and chronicles from across the empire. A Persian poet, writing in the 1250s, a man who would have been a child during the conquest of his region, wrote verses about the generation of orphans, children who grew up never knowing their true parentage because their mothers had been enslaved and their fathers could have been any Mongol soldier. These children belonged nowhere fully not to the conquered populations, not to the Mongol elite. They were living embodiments of conquest's lasting wounds. Chinese records document a practice where Mongol administrators would force enslaved populations to participate in the destruction of their own cultural heritage. Buddhist monks forced to tear down their monasteries stone by stone, Confucian scholars forced to burn libraries. This wasn't about military necessity. It was about forcing people to participate in their own cultural annihilation, to make them complicit in what was being done to them. The psychological research on modern atrocities has shown that forcing victims to participate in their own victimization is one of the most effective ways to create lasting trauma and prevent resistance. Genghis Khan's administrators understood this principle 800 years ago. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, he left behind more than an empire. He left behind a machinery of domination that had reshaped continents. For over 2 decades, his rule had enslaved millions and built a system of exploitation that his sons and grandsons continued to refine. As the Mongol Empire expanded across China, Russia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, the number of enslaved people grew with it. Yet, alongside this violence, the empire's vastness produced unexpected consequences. Forced migrations and the collision of cultures created new intellectual currents. Persian astronomy entered China. Chinese printing diffused into the Islamic world, and trade routes carved by enslaved labor became arteries of global exchange. None of this erases the suffering. It simply reminds us that history never fits cleanly into moral categories. The same system that devastated millions, also through coercion and movement-linked worlds previously isolated some descendants of enslaved populations, later rose to prominence within Mongol administration. Meanwhile, genetic legacies of conquest survive in millions alive today, reminders of the empire's intimate brutality. Archival records in cities once under Mongol rule capture this contradiction with stark clarity. Census rolls reduce human beings to inventory, itemized by skill, age, and location. Yet in the margins appear fleeting gestures of recognition, a Chinese official urging the preservation of skilled workers, a Persian scribe noting the name of an enslaved man who died. These small traces complicate the story. They show that even within systems designed to erase humanity, people continued to see one another as human. The chronicles of Genghis Khan's final days preserve another such moment, an elderly enslaved woman captured as a girl, weeping at his death. Her grief doesn't absolve anything. It only reveals the tangled truth of human experience. Look back now. The line of captives stretches across centuries, shaping the world we inhabit. They were not footnotes to conquest, they were its foundation, and their legacy remains embedded in the modern world in ways still unfolding.